5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Lawrence. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm so appreciative of you coming here to discuss this issue. Invasive species affect our economy, our environment, human health in many instances, and although we haven't focused on it today, and I didn't hear it in your testimonies, invasive species such as lionfish, brown tree snake, and even invasive sorghum seaweed have had a devastating effect on all aspects of the economic development, agricultural production, and tourism, particularly in my district in the United States Virgin Islands and in some parts of southeastern United States. I note that several of my colleagues from Florida have introduced legislation related to the lionfish, which are an invasive, voracious eating species that is not native to the waters in which they've come, and have completely attempted in their eating habits to annihilate our own local fish. And our fishermen are up in arms. Our Department of Planning and Natural Resources are trying to create ways to deal with this invasive species, both in the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and particularly in Florida, areas of Florida as well. And there's been some success in controlling a few of the invasive species, but it's clear you all are completely aware that we need to do more. Ms. Reeser, according to the submitted testimony, you've taken on some really important initiatives, and one of those initiatives is to focus on national priorities and targeted outputs. I wanted to know if you could tell us what the national priorities are, and what do you mean by targeted outputs? And specifically, of course, my interest would be if the territories are included in those priorities.
Certainly the territories are explicitly included in the work we do, and thank you for highlighting them in particular. They do face many challenges that are particular to island regions. As you're probably well aware, invasive species are one of the #1 threats to biodiversity in island contexts, and that's certainly been the case in the U.S. territories. The national priorities are set within the National Invasive Species Management Plan in terms of how the federal government is going to work together, but also with states, territories, tribes, and other partners. So each management plan sets forward a new set of priorities, and so we'll have a new set early this next year.
And how is that determined? In what way? Is it by population? Is it based on economic determinants? What sets those priorities?
Ann Kinzinger would like to address that.
Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to say I'm not speaking to what will be in the plan, but that there are a number of scientifically based techniques that we can use. One of them is to model the invasivity of the animal once it's detected, and try to get a sense of how quickly it will spread, and try to be able to understand what kind of impacts it's going to have, because there are many invasive species that come to the country and really don't cause much damage, don't spread very quickly. So we have a variety of tools that we're trying to use that managers and policymakers can deploy to understand how quickly and how damaging from both an ecological and an economic perspective.
Because the reason I was asking what are the benchmarks and how do you determine that is that more often than not, my area, the Virgin Islands, because it's seen that we are small in numbers, we're not as given the priorities. And I just wanted to share something with the committee today, and I'm asking that we show this picture, and I will pass this around, that this is what happens when the invasive species, the sorghum seaweed, which if you think about an island economy that's based on fishing and tourism, if that's sitting on your beach, it's going to affect your tourism tremendously on a regular basis, and that's on every beach in the Virgin Islands these last couple of months. So thank you, and if I'd ask unanimous consent to include this in the record. And I just wanted to then close with, I know I'm running out of time, Mr. Beck, if you could tell us if you feel that there needs to be a change and improvement in controlling this and how we set these priorities.
I am not familiar with the seaweed problem other than I'm just aware that it exists. I'm not the expert to ask on that. But if we do not have the information, it needs to be dealt with immediately. That seems to be the case with almost every new invasive species. You know, where are we scientifically on it? That's an excellent question to ask, and I think we need to address these species only, unfortunately, one at a time. But that's part of the challenge in this, and they all need to be addressed.
With no objection, the picture will be included in the record.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to go back to something that we were talking about and that the ranking member, Ms. Lawrence, brought up. When you talked about this is layering and the responses that come from the local level to the state level to the federal level, we also talked about the management plan, and I know it's the specific task and the mandate of this group to really set those kind of guidelines and those prioritizations out. Can you give me an example of how this has worked in some of these invasive species? In your written testimony, you talked about the Asian carp. You talked about cheatgrass. You know, we've given the example about the lionfish. How has this worked to address some of these issues, or some of these specific invasive species issues?
Thank you for the question. You're particularly interested in the coordination mechanisms.
Well, I'm trying to find out some specificity, and because I just hear a lot of very general discussion about how the process works, and that the management plans are there to make this happen. But I haven't been given, and I haven't heard, maybe it was done, what specific examples you have of where this has worked and where the organization, where this group has actually made it effective against some of these invasive species.
Okay. So I want to clarify once again that the National Invasive Species Council is itself the secretaries and administrators of the 13-member federal departments. So when we start moving on to discussions about impacts on the ground, we're looking at the engagement at the agency level and agency personnel.
Right, but you set those priorities in that national plan and the management of how that's going to be done. Isn't that right? And your coordination of all of these agencies.
The management plan sets out a series of actions to be taken over the life of the management plan.
And the management plan is how, in fact, these agencies are going to attack these invasive species issues, right?
The management plan sets out goals and objectives for achieving certain aims. It's not prescriptive in telling the agencies how specifically to move forward on that particular action item. But it sets out
and guidelines for these agencies on how this is supposed to be done? That's just a yes or a no. Does it?
It sets out priority actions for them. It doesn't explicitly set out guidelines.
So in setting the priorities for them, can you give me an example of how those priorities, having been set since this group has been made, how it has been effective in the invasive species fight?
Okay, so I can give you a specific example for what's happening on the ground right now within the work that's being done on cheatgrass. Under a second,
is that the only one? Is that the only way you're able to tell me what is working on? You're not able to tell me what has been done and what has been effective in the past as yet?
I can go through a number of action items in the plan. There are 170 various action items, and I can go through with you at a later date.
Are there too many action items?
Pardon?
Are there too many action items, maybe? If I give my kids too many chores, they'll never get to any of them completed.
I understand your concern with the number of activities in the action items, and I can assure you in the next management plan,
I'm not
there will be
concerned.
far
You just
fewer.
cited so many of them as a reason why you're not able to tell me which ones they've completed.
I don't have, well, I can pull out the two management plans at the moment, and I could go through them with you. We don't have time, obviously, to do that right now. It's something we could sit down
I just
and
asked
do
for
together.
one example.
So one example in a management plan was to provide resources to develop an international infrastructure for sharing information on invasive species. A number of activities actually taken place to result in that. The Global Invasive Species Information Network was created that is housed by the U.S. Geological Survey. We've also contributed resources to setting up a global database, you could call it a global encyclopedia, through an organization known as CABI. That provides information that can be used in the agricultural sector and the environmental sector and otherwise to inform decision-making, such as risk analyses and risk assessments on the invasive species issue.
And any of these, have you been able to show where the action items, the action that's been taken, has actually scaled back the invasive species, or what the impact that those have had on the particular areas that they've affected?
At this point in time, without actually going to the agencies and asking for that particular
How can you
data.
ask? That's the ultimate goal of the group. Wouldn't that be something that you would know immediately to be able to say that what you have been working on all these years, this is the outcome, and this is how we've been able to beat back this national crisis, this national security issue?
I understand your concern, and if the management plan action items were specifically targeted towards an on-the-ground response, that would be feasible, and I can collect that information. Many of the items in the management plans are actually focused on enhancing coordination, cooperation, efficiencies in resource spending, partnerships with states and tribes and other governments.
Isn't all of that the ultimate goal is to eradicate the invasive species?
They're all creating the enabling environment to allow that to happen.
Dr. Reeser, that's just yes or no. Isn't that the ultimate goal of the organization, is to do that?
The ultimate
Yes,
goal of the
no?
National Invasive Species Council is to facilitate coordination and cooperation, the specific duties that are outlined in the executive order.
To what end?
Ultimately, to the end of preventing and
So the answer
controlling and
would be-
eradicating invasive species. However, the activities are often many steps removed from what's happening on the ground. So the ability to say we've created an invasive species database is creating an enabling environment to enable people on the ground, whether that's cheatgrass or zebra mussels or weevils in Texas, to make a difference. However, being able to say that the data in that database directly resulted in 300 infestations being intercepted in the field is understandably quite difficult.
Thank you.